So, so as we all know, we have an upcoming presidential election coming up. It's pretty cool, and we're all probably just freshmen or sophomore here in college, or maybe we even turned 18, and we're all rabbled in part of this political phenomenon that we could participate in perhaps the first time in our lives. So who here is going to vote? Well, I'm sure not, and neither should you. Around the same time year last year, when I had recently turned 18 and was preparing for the AP US government test, which by the way, I got a 4 on. My teacher was high in spirit, anticipating for the 2016 election, eager to touch up on our political efficacy that she would only get to show off every 2 or 4 years. And she was proud that her students would be able to participate in voting ballots after almost 2 decades of waiting and spending an entire year learning about the United States political system in her class. But whenever she would go off about the joys of voting, I would just slump down in my chair and go, man, why do I care? Can I really make a difference? And the answer to that is no. And that's for all of you as well. Why? Because as long as the country continues to uphold its current method of deciding who the next president is, the Electoral College fails to represent United States voters. Every 4 years, when it's time to elect a new president and people parade down to their nearby voting booth, over 120 million Americans waste their time because the fate and outcome of each presidential election lies solely in the ballots of roughly only half a thousand people. Over the next several minutes, I'll be going over the various ways in which the Electoral College essentially disregards American votes and metaphorically tosses them into the trash. The Electoral College is the United States voting institution, first introduced in 1787, created so that only a select handful of the nation's intellectuals would determine and vote for the country's next president through representation of states, rather than taking into account votes in the masses. This is an issue because indirect voting for the president proposes potential opportunities for electors to ignore those that they're supposed to represent and tarnish the voting rights of the large population. A common misconception that a large number of Americans have about the presidential election is that the national popular vote is what determines the winner, which is false because the result of an election is concluded by the electors from the states, not the citizens of the country. Subsequently, another misconception that Americans have is that their votes contribute directly to the election of the next president, which is also false. Which is also not true because the votes that the typical American cast only partially affect the voting direction of the electors who carry the real weight of deciding the winner. As a result, electors are set aside on an entirely different level and class than the people that they represent. Because of how important the Electoral College is, the Electoral College is stressed during the elections, the obligation of voting faithfully according to the state's popular vote that every elector swears to uphold must be kept. However, in numerous cases in the past, corrupted electors have been casting their votes based on their own personal interests rather than the people that they're supposed to represent. And a report by Fair Vote, a nonpartisan organization that encourages and seeks to spread a fair, functional, and representative democracy. In the 1968 presidential election, Dr. Lloyd Bailey, an elector of the Republican Party in North Carolina, as part of his duty, pledged that he would vote for the Republican nominee according to a voting census in his state, but instead decided to vote unfaithfully and casted his electoral vote at a third-party candidate because he disliked Nixon and didn't want him to win, in complete disregard and spite to the people he was supposed to represent. When electors represent the voting body of an entire state, it raises a serious concern when all these voices, hopes, and rights are concentrated and invested into only a handful of precious votes, and an elector decides to thwart these efforts by voting in the entirely opposite direction. As a result, the Electoral College fails to represent voters because there are too many desires in the country and within states to be bestowed upon only a handful of people that all have the power to act according to their own personal agenda. The winner-take-all system that goes underway in the Electoral College system of voting is a rule that grants a presidential candidate all of the state's electoral votes if they win the majority of them, which in every situation disenfranchises voters by negating and even flipping the votes against the candidate that they cast their ballot for. Let's take a look at. Thank you.
I have him with 40 more seconds.
Yeah, he's still like a.
Oh, okay, just checking. Just checking, okay. Yeah, recount, thanks. Now, Alex, I think we have an example here of one of those things that happens when you've got an essay instead of a speech. You've got ideas that you want to talk about. You've got a language that you have written out. You've got this whole thing that has been creatively put together, and it's great to read, but for an oral argument, it's a little bit problematic. And you need to simplify your claims quite a bit and get to the essence of the argument a little bit faster. Look, I know what your proposition is. It's written right here, so that's easy for me. And I heard you say the proposition in the opening part of the speech, but it's not very clear that that's the proposition for everybody else. So if they aren't listening closely, they're going to miss it. And you need to signpost it a lot more clearly so that people know that that's the point. There are a whole bunch of secondary issues that you're going to talk about, but they all start running together, and you get so involved in talking about the first one that you're running out of time to talk about any of the others, and that's a bit of a problem. So you need to be able to simply say, I'm going to argue that the Electoral College fails to represent United States voters, one, because electors can defect, two, because voters in a lot of states are automatically disenfranchised where their votes go to a different candidate because that candidate won the state, and three, because of whatever the other arguments are, disproportional representation or something like that. Now let's go to that first point, the defecting electors that I mentioned, and then give your example. You do have a good example here. Of course, it is a 60-year-old example, so it doesn't sound like it's something that, it's going to likely occur. But thinking about all the stuff that's going on in the primaries right now, and the caucuses, and the Republican side, where there's talk about the delegates maybe changing their votes, you might say there could easily be some chicanery that goes on here in a close election where electors might in fact decide to take things into their own hands, and we could see that kind of thing is happening, for example, at the caucus level right now. Why would we assume that it wouldn't happen at a national level? I think that would be a reasonable argument to make there. But if you're just going to rely on the idea that occasionally electors defect, and we've got one example from 1960, that's not particularly convincing. I think you've got a better argument about people being disenfranchised, but you need to explain it a little bit more. So, for instance, in the state of California, if the Democrats outnumber the Republicans in terms of registration, something like 3-2. So it's pretty much considered a safe state, a blue state in the presidential elections. So let's assume that, I'm making up numbers. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips. Let's say that's 14 million voters, and 9 million of them vote for the Democrat, and 5 million of them vote for the Republican. Those 5 million votes of the Republicans don't mean anything because they don't count, only the electoral votes count. And even though it might have changed in the popular vote someplace else, that's not going to matter because of the way the Electoral College works. You kind of have to explain these concepts directly, and like I said, it seems to me like you've written it out like it's an essay as opposed to an oral argument. I thought you were doing a good job presenting at the beginning of the speech. You were on the right track. You just need to kind of get to the point, make the claims clear, and make your evidence a little bit more convincing here and there. All right, we'll stop there. Thank you.